Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about the most impossible place on Earth and the people who made it home. Places where the sun could literally cook your blood, where a single mistake meant death, where water was more precious than diamonds. And yet, somehow, some people didn't just survive there. They thrived. They built entire civilizations in landscapes that should have been graveyards. Dim the lights if you haven't already. Get comfortable. Let your shoulders drop. Let that tension in your jaw just dissolve. Tonight, we're traveling somewhere that will make your warm bed feel like the greatest luxury in human history. Let me know in the comments what country and city you're watching from, and what time it is right now. I love knowing you're out there, sharing this quiet moment with me. Maybe in London at 2 a.m, or Sydney at dawn, or somewhere in between where the world feels soft and sleepy. The Bedouins, desert nomads who turned hell into home. People who looked at temperatures that could melt lead and said, "This seems like a nice place to raise children." They developed survival techniques so sophisticated that modern science is still catching up. They created poetry out of privation, art out of extremity, wisdom out of want. But here's what's beautiful about their story. It's not really about the desert at all. It's about what happens to humans when everything easy is stripped away. When you can't rely on grocery stores or air conditioning or GPS or any of the 1,000 small conveniences that keep us alive without us even noticing. It's about what's left when all that's gone. And what's left, it turns out, is everything that actually matters. Tonight, we'll learn how they read water in the flight patterns of birds, how they built homes that breathed in the crushing heat, how they navigated by stars across landscapes with no landmarks, no roads, no signs saying this way to not dying. We'll discover why they wore dark colors in blazing sun, how they made 1 cup of water last 2 days, why they chose to live in places where modern humans would perish in hours. Only if this calms you, only if it helps you drift, let this story carry you somewhere timeless. Somewhere where survival was an art form, where every sunset was earned, where people learned to dance with the most hostile environment on Earth, and somehow found grace in it. The desert doesn't negotiate. It doesn't compromise. It simply exists, vast and patient, and absolutely indifferent to human wants. And yet the Bedouins learned to love it, more than love it. They learned to read it like a book, to speak its language, to move through it like water finding its level. So close your eyes, and let me take you somewhere impossible, where the sun could melt your bones. But somehow, some people learn to dance with it, where the silence is so complete it has weight, where the stars are so bright they cast shadows, where every breath is a small victory against the odds. You wake in darkness, but it's not your darkness. This isn't the familiar weight of your blankets, the gentle hum of your heater or air conditioner, the distant sound of traffic or neighbors. This is a different kind of silence altogether. Ancient, patient, vast. The air tastes different. Dry. So dry it pulls moisture from your lungs with every breath. There's no humidity here, no softness in the atmosphere. Just clarity, so sharp it seems to cut. You run your tongue across your lips and they're already rough, already beginning to crack. How long have you been here? Minutes? Hours? Time feels different in this place. You feel sand between your fingers that wasn't there before. Not the fine sand of beaches, soft and welcoming. This is coarser, older, sand that's been ground by 1,000,000 years of wind, polished by temperatures that could crack stone. Each grain carries the memory of mountains worn down to dust, of time moving so slowly, it's almost geological. The silence is so complete, it has weight. It presses against your eardrums like deep water. You strain to hear something, anything, but there's nothing. No birds, no insects, no rustle of leaves because there are no leaves to rustle. Just the faint whisper of your own breathing, suddenly loud in this endless quiet. Gradually, your eyes adjust. Above you, stars. But not the handful of faint lights you might see from your bedroom window. These are stars in their full glory. Thousands upon thousands of them. So bright they seem close enough to pluck. The Milky Way stretches across the sky like spilled cream, and you realize you've never actually seen the night sky before. Not really. Not like this. The air is cooling now. Strange. During the day, this place could kill you with heat, but night brings cold that seeps into your bones. You pull your arms closer to your body and feel fabric you don't remember putting on. Rough wool. Thick and scratchy, but somehow comforting. Practical. Made for this place. And that's when you realize you're not alone. You can't see them yet, but you sense them. Others who belong here. People who know this place, who've learned its rhythms, who've made peace with its impossible demands. Their presence is like warmth in the distance, like the promise of fire and shelter, and the kind of safety that comes from knowledge passed down through generations. You begin to understand that you're sitting in the middle of forever. Sand stretches to every horizon, unmarked by roads or buildings, or any sign that humans have ever been here. Yet somehow, impossibly, you're not lost, because there are paths here, invisible to your untrained eyes, but real as highways to those who know how to see them. The desert breathes around you. You can feel it, the subtle expansion and contraction of cooling sand, the almost imperceptible shift of air currents, the way the landscape itself seems alive in the darkness. This isn't the dead, empty wasteland you might have imagined. This is a living system, complex and ancient, and surprisingly fragile. Your body is learning new things without your permission. How to conserve moisture with each breath. How to move without disturbing the sand unnecessarily. How to listen with senses you didn't know you had. Feeling for the vibrations that mean water, wind, the approach of sandstorm or the promise of dawn. The stars wheel overhead, and you realize they're not just pretty lights, but a navigation system more precise than any GPS. Each constellation is a street sign, each star a landmark pointing toward water, toward shelter, toward the invisible roads that crisscross this seeming emptiness. You're beginning to feel it now. The strange peace that comes from being truly small. In your regular life, you're important. You have responsibilities, schedules, people depending on you. But here, under this vast sky, in this ancient silence, you're just another speck of life trying to make it through the night. And somehow, that's deeply comforting. The temperature continues to drop. Soon, you'll understand why desert peoples treasure thick blankets, why they build fires from dried dung and scattered scrub, why they sleep close together, not just for warmth, but for the simple comfort of not being alone in all this infinity. But for now, you're learning the first lesson of the desert. Patience. Nothing here happens quickly. The sun rises slowly. Water is found gradually. Survival is earned minute by minute, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. There are no shortcuts in this classroom, no way to speed up the curriculum. You learn at the pace the desert sets, or you don't learn at all. And as your eyes adjust to this impossible darkness, you begin to see. There are paths here, paths worn smooth by feet that learn to be light as whispers, quick as shadows, paths that lead between this world and survival, between the hostile and the habitable, between the place where humans die and the place where they somehow, impossibly, learn to live. Water becomes mathematics when your life depends on it. Not the abstract numbers you learned in school, but arithmetic written in flesh and blood, calculated in heartbeats and measured in the hours you have left before your body gives up its most essential negotiation with existence. You learn to count differently here. 1 cup, 2 days, 3 chances to find more before the counting stops forever. Your body is approximately 60% water, but the desert doesn't care about approximations. It wants precision. It wants to know exactly how much you brought to this conversation and exactly how fast you're willing to give it up. Because you will give it up. The only question is whether you'll do it wisely, drop by precious drop, or whether you'll waste it in panic and die with an empty canteen and a mouthful of regret. The Bedouins turned this arithmetic into art. They learned to read their bodies like water clocks, feeling for the subtle signs that meant they were moving from abundance towards scarcity, toward desperation. The slight stickiness of saliva, the way their pulse felt different when dehydration began its quiet work, the color of their urine darker each time, telling them stories they needed to hear. But they also learned to read the world around them, as if it were covered in invisible signs saying water this way and death that way. Birds never fly far from water, so watch the birds. Certain plants only grow where groundwater runs close to the surface, so learn the plants. Animals create paths between feeding grounds and watering holes, so follow the animals even when those paths seem to lead toward emptiness. They developed a dozen ways to make 3 sips last until sunset. Not just rationing. That's the amateur's approach. The way people die with water still in their bottles because they saved it too carefully. No, they learned the rhythm of hydration, the careful dance between conservation and consumption, that keeps the body's most essential processes functioning without waste. Morning water tastes different than evening water, not just because your thirst changes, but because your body's needs change with the temperature, with the work you've done, with the work still ahead. They learn to sip at dawn, not just to wet their throats, but to prepare their kidneys for the day's heat. They learn to drink at dusk, not just to replace what they'd lost, but to prepare for the night's deceptive cold. Water divination became their science, reading the landscape for the subtle signs that meant life could exist in that place. The way morning mist clung to certain valleys, the color of sand in specific seasons, the behavior of insects that most people never notice, but which telegraph the presence of moisture to anyone who knows their language. They carved wells in places that looked like nothing special, guided by knowledge passed down through generations of thirsty ancestors. Not just digging holes and hoping, but understanding the underground geography of aquifers and seasonal flows, the hidden rivers that run beneath the visible emptiness. Storage became sacred, not just carrying water, but preserving it, keeping it cool when everything else burned, keeping it clean when dust tried to turn it into mud. Goatskin bags that breathed just enough to allow evaporation for cooling, but not so much that precious liquid was lost to the air. Ceramic vessels buried during the day to stay cool, dug up at night when the temperature dropped. They learned to see water in places where others saw only thirst. The condensation that formed inside tent walls during the brief cool hours before dawn. The moisture that could be squeezed from certain cacti, bitter but life-sustaining. The techniques for collecting dew on fabric spread across bushes, then wringing those few precious drops into vessels. But perhaps most importantly, they learned the psychology of thirst. How panic makes you waste water. How fear makes you drink too much too fast. How hope can make you ration too carefully and die with water still undrunk. They developed mental disciplines for managing the constant awareness of scarcity, ways of thinking that kept them calm when their bodies were screaming for more than they could afford to give. Water became prayer, each drop appreciated, each sip a small communion with the forces that might keep them alive another day. Not taken for granted, never wasted, always respected as the liquid that stood between them and the quiet mathematics of death. They understood, something we've forgotten in our air-conditioned abundance, that water isn't just something you drink when you're thirsty. Water is liquid time, liquid life, liquid possibility. It's the difference between walking another mile or stopping forever in the sand. It's the medium in which all other survival calculations take place. 3 sips at dawn. Measure the day's heat against the night's cold. Count the miles between here and the next known water. Calculate the weight of hope against the mathematics of thirst. Solve for survival, one drop at a time, knowing that the equation only works if you can make it balance until you reach the next source, the next oasis, the next chance to reset the count and begin the calculation again. And in that careful accounting, in that precise attention to what keeps life possible, they found something that goes beyond survival. They found reverence. They found the sacred hidden in the simple. They found God in a cup of water shared between strangers crossing impossible distances together. Shade becomes architecture when the sun wants to kill you. Not the casual shadow you might enjoy on a summer afternoon, but engineering designed to stand between your body and temperatures that could literally cook your blood. The Bedouin tent isn't just shelter, it's a machine for manufacturing coolness in the middle of hell. Every angle calculated, every weave considered, every stake placed with the precision of someone who understands that getting this wrong means death by degrees, slow and certain as sunrise. You might think you'd want light, colors in the blazing desert sun, white fabric to reflect heat, pale materials to bounce back the radiation trying to turn your temporary home into an oven. But you'd be wrong. And being wrong about shade in the desert is the kind of mistake you only make once. Black fabric, dark and heavy as midnight. That's what they chose. Not despite the heat, but because of it. Because dark colors absorb heat, yes, but they also create the temperature differentials that make air move. And moving air, even hot air, is the difference between survival and slow cooking. The physics of desert tent design would impress modern engineers. Hot air rises, so let it rise, right through carefully placed openings at the peak. Cool air sinks, so create low entrances where it can flow in. The tent becomes a chimney, a pump, a gentle engine that pulls heat up and out while drawing whatever coolness exists down and in. The weave matters too. Not too tight. Air needs to move through the fabric itself, allowing evaporation to cool the interior surface. Not too loose. Dust storms and sandstorms will fill your shelter with the very environment you're trying to escape. Just the right permeability, the right balance between protection and ventilation. Goat hair. Black goat hair. Coarse and almost waterproof when dry, but with the strange property of swelling when wet, creating an even tighter seal against rain during the brief seasons when rain might actually fall. Hair that's been tested by thousands of years of desert living, proven by generations of people who died when they got the details wrong. The geometry of comfort becomes visible in how they arrange these dark sanctuaries. Not randomly scattered, but positioned to create shared shade, communal coolness, social spaces, where the architecture of survival becomes the foundation for community. Families sleeping close enough to share air currents, but far enough apart to maintain privacy and dignity. Watch how they stake the corners. The wind here isn't just weather, it's a force that can collapse your shelter or, properly managed, become part of your cooling system. Stakes driven deep, angles calculated to catch helpful breezes while deflecting harmful gusts. The tent skin, pitched taut as a drum, because sagging fabric traps heat instead of channeling it away. Inside, the temperature can be 20 degrees cooler than outside. 20 degrees that spell the difference between consciousness and heat stroke, between thinking clearly and making the kind of confused decisions that get you killed. 20 degrees of grace, engineered from fabric and knowledge, and the accumulated wisdom of people who learned that survival is often a matter of understanding physics you can't afford to get wrong. The social geometry of shade becomes crucial during the hottest hours. How many people can share the cool space beneath one tent without body heat, overwhelming the carefully managed airflow? How do you arrange sleeping mats so everyone gets some benefit from the ventilation system? How do you balance hospitality with thermal dynamics when offering shelter to strangers? Portable architecture. That's what this really represents. Homes that can be folded, carried, reconstructed wherever the search for water and pasture leads. Every component serving multiple purposes. Tent poles that become walking sticks, guy ropes that become tool handles, fabric that becomes ground cover or blanket or privacy screen as needs change. The sound of wind through proper tent fabric becomes a lullaby, the gentle flutter and whisper that means your shelter is breathing correctly, processing heat and coolness, in the subtle exchange that keeps the interior livable. Different sounds mean different problems. The sharp snap that warns of excessive tension, the heavy flapping that suggests inadequate staking, the ominous silence that means no air is moving at all. They learn to read their shelters like instruments, feeling for the slight vibrations that indicated proper airflow, listening for the acoustic signatures that meant everything was working as it should. A tent that sounds wrong, feels wrong, and feeling wrong in the desert is information you need to act on immediately. Even the entrances were designed with thermal engineering in mind. Low openings that stayed cool during the heat of the day, but could be adjusted as temperatures changed. Flaps that could be opened to catch evening breezes, closed against sandstorms, reconfigured as the sun moved across the sky and changed the angle of attack of its killing heat. The architecture of shade extended beyond individual tents to the larger geometry of camp layout. How to position multiple shelters so they created cooling corridors between them, channels where night breezes could flow and be captured. How to use the thermal mass of the earth itself, digging shallow depressions that stayed cooler during the day, building up ridges that cast longer shadows. This wasn't just building shelter. This was creating microclimates, manufacturing habitability in places that should have been uninhabitable, taking the raw materials of fabric and rope and stakes and human knowledge and building coolness itself, engineering comfort from the most hostile environment on Earth. But even the most perfect tent was useless if you didn't understand the enemy. Because heat had moods. Noon is when the desert stops pretending to be merely difficult and reveals itself as actively murderous. This isn't the gentle warmth of a summer afternoon or the pleasant heat of a beach vacation. This is temperature as weapon, heat as predator, the sun transformed from life-giver into executioner. At noon, shadows disappear, not metaphorically, literally. The sun sits directly overhead like a judge delivering verdict, and that verdict is death by degrees for anything foolish enough to move during the hour when even shadows abandon their posts. Your body begins to betray you in ways that feel personal. Sweat that should cool you instead robs you of water you can't afford to lose. Blood that should circulate normally begins to thicken as dehydration sets in. Your heart works harder, pumping sluggish fluid through vessels that are trying to manage. Heat loads your evolution never prepared you for. But the Bedouins learned something remarkable about this most dangerous hour. They learned that surviving noon isn't just about finding shade. It's about surrendering to it completely, about understanding that some battles can only be won by refusing to fight them. The siesta isn't laziness, it's strategy. When the sun reaches its murderous peak, when temperatures climb past what human physiology can handle, the wise response isn't heroic endurance. It's tactical retreat into whatever coolness you've managed to create, whatever shade you've engineered, whatever shelter you've built between yourself and the sky's assault. They learned to read their bodies like early warning systems for heat, exhaustion, the subtle nausea that means you're approaching your limits, the way your vision begins to shimmer at the edges when your brain starts to overheat, the strange lightheadedness that feels almost like altitude sickness but signals something more dangerous. Your core temperature rising past the narrow range where consciousness remains reliable. Mental discipline becomes survival skill when heat starts affecting your judgment. Because extreme temperature doesn't just challenge your body, it rewrites your psychology, making you stupid in precisely the ways that get you killed. You start making decisions that seem reasonable, but are actually heat-induced confusion wearing the mask of logic. They developed meditation techniques born from necessity, mental practices that helped them stay calm when their bodies were screaming with discomfort. Not transcendental mysticism, but practical psychology for managing the constant awareness that you're living right at the edge of what human beings can endure. The underground coolness of buried spaces became their sanctuary during the worst hours. Not deep caves, those were rare luxuries, but shallow depressions lined with stones, covered with fabric, designed to trap whatever coolness the earth retained from the previous night. Temporary refuges that could mean the difference between staying conscious and collapsing into heat stroke. Noon brought visions, not spiritual experiences, but the predictable hallucinations that come when your brain starts to overheat. Desert peoples learn to recognize these mirages of the mind, to distinguish between the heat dreams that meant nothing and the genuine perceptual cues that might lead to water, to shade, to survival. They understood that extreme heat changes time itself. Minutes stretch like hours when you're counting heartbeats and measuring the slow movement of shadows that might eventually offer relief. They learned patience not as virtue, but as technique, psychological tools for enduring discomfort that could last for hours without relief. The psychology of shared suffering became crucial during peak heat hours. How groups of people manage the collective stress of knowing that everyone is struggling, everyone is uncomfortable, everyone is dancing right at the edge of their physiological limits. The social dynamics of staying calm when panic could spread through a camp like wildfire. They learned to sleep through the worst heat, but not the easy sleep of comfortable beds. This was the sleep of conservation, the body's emergency protocols for reducing metabolic activity when external conditions became too extreme for normal function. Light sleep that kept them alert to changes in wind or temperature that might signal relief or new danger. Water discipline reached its peak during noon hours. Not just rationing, but timing. When to sip to maintain core temperature without triggering the body's cooling responses that would waste precious moisture through increased sweating. The delicate balance between hydration and conservation when every drop counted towards survival. The mental tricks for managing thermal stress became part of their cultural knowledge. Visualization techniques that helped the mind distance itself from bodily discomfort. Breathing patterns that helped regulate temperature and conserve moisture. Ways of thinking that kept panic at bay when your body was sending constant signals that you were in mortal danger. They learned to trust their thermal engineering when their instincts screamed at them to run, to move, to do something active about their discomfort. The discipline to stay in shade, even when staying still, felt like giving up. To remain in their carefully constructed cool spaces, even when movement felt like it might provide relief. Noon became their teacher in the psychology of limitation. Hour by hour, they learned that human beings can endure far more discomfort than they think possible, but only if they approach that endurance systematically, with techniques developed over generations of practice at the edges of survivability. The hour when everything stops, when birds find whatever shelter they can and don't move, when insects disappear into crevices and burrows, when even the hardiest desert plants close their stomata and wait for evening. The hour when the only wise response is to join this great conspiracy of stillness, this collective decision to pause all unnecessary activity until the sun moves past its most murderous angle. But they also learned something profound about the psychology of extreme conditions, that accepting your powerlessness in the face of natural forces doesn't make you weak, it makes you wise. Fighting noon is like fighting gravity or arguing with winter. The strength lies not in resistance, but in adaptation, not in heroic endurance, but in intelligent surrender. And when the sun finally began its descent, when shadows grew long enough to trust again, that's when the real work began. Movement becomes dance when every step could be your last. Not the carefree walking, from sidewalks and hiking trails, but choreographed motion where rhythm means survival and grace means getting there alive. Desert walking is an art form they perfected over centuries, not the steady trudge of determined hikers or the quick pace of people with places to be, but something more like water, finding its level, fluid, adaptive, always seeking the path of least resistance through landscape that offers no easy paths at all. Watch how they place their feet, never fighting the sand, never trying to force solid footing where none exists. Instead, they learn to work with the surface that shifts beneath every step, finding the brief moments of stability between sliding and sinking, moving forward through controlled falling rather than conquering terrain. The rhythm of desert walking matches the rhythm of desert breathing, measured, conservative, designed to continue for hours without the kind of exertion that wastes water through excessive sweating. Each step calculated not just for distance covered, but for energy preserved, for body heat managed, for moisture conserved in the endless arithmetic of survival. They learn to read sand like other people read road signs. The subtle differences, in color and texture, that indicated firm footing versus treacherous softness. The patterns left by wind that showed which surfaces would support weight and which would swallow feet like hungry mouths. The art of walking on ground that wasn't quite ground, that shifted and changed beneath every footfall. Early morning walking, when the sand was cool enough to touch without burning, when their bodies were fresh from night's rest and ready for the day's careful expenditure of energy. Late evening walking, when shadows grew long enough to offer some protection and temperatures began their merciful descent toward night. But never noon walking, never the kind of movement that put them in direct conflict with the sun during its most murderous hours. They learned the discipline of stopping, of finding or creating shade, and waiting for the sun to move past its worst angles before continuing their carefully planned journeys across impossible distances. The social choreography of group movement became crucial for survival. How to space travelers so that everyone could benefit from whatever shade existed without crowding into thermal chaos. How to arrange the walking order so that the strongest could break trail through difficult sand while the most vulnerable followed. In easier footsteps, navigation by consensus, by collective wisdom, pooled from every member of the group who might have walked this route before, or seen these landmarks, or remembered these star patterns from previous journeys. No single person bearing the full responsibility for keeping everyone alive, but shared knowledge that made the group smarter than any individual could be alone. Camel choreography added another layer of complexity to desert movement. These weren't horses that could be simply ridden from point A to point B, but partners in survival who had their own wisdom about desert travel, their own instincts for finding water and avoiding danger, learning to work with animals that were better adapted to this environment than their human companions. The bells on camel necks weren't decoration. They were communication systems that allowed caravans to stay together across vast distances, where visibility was limited by heat shimmer and blowing sand. Each animal's bells had slightly different tones, creating a mobile symphony that told experienced travelers exactly who was where and how everyone was doing. Pack weight became choreography too, not just what to carry, but how to distribute loads, so that both animals and humans could maintain the careful energy balance that allowed for days or weeks of continuous travel. Every extra pound had to justify itself in terms of survival value versus the additional energy required to transport it. They developed techniques for walking in sandstorms that seem almost supernatural to modern eyes, moving by feel when visibility dropped to zero, using rope connections and voice calls to maintain group cohesion when the world disappeared in stinging, blinding chaos. Navigation by wind direction and ground texture when even the sun became invisible. Rest choreography was as important as movement choreography. How to stop without losing forward momentum. How to rest without allowing muscles to stiffen in ways that would make resuming travel difficult or dangerous. The art of partial rest that refreshed the body without surrendering the rhythm of travel. Water discipline during movement required its own set of techniques. When to sip to maintain performance without triggering excessive sweating. How to time hydration so that water was available when the body needed it most without carrying unnecessary weight or risking spills that could waste precious liquid. The psychology of endless walking, of covering distances that would challenge. Modern vehicles across terrain with no roads, no markers, no guarantee that the destination actually existed where memory and tradition claimed it should be. Mental techniques for managing the constant awareness that you were crossing distances measured in days while carrying only supplies measured in hours. Emergency movement protocols for when things went wrong, when storms hit earlier than expected, when water sources had dried up, when someone became too sick or injured to maintain normal travel pace. How to modify the choreography of movement to accommodate crisis without abandoning the fundamental principles that kept everyone alive. They moved like water moves, finding the path of least resistance, flowing around obstacles, always seeking the lowest ground where travel was easiest and shade was most likely, never fighting the desert directly, never trying to impose their will on landscape that was infinitely more patient and powerful than they were. Each caravan became a flowing river of life, crossing vast emptiness, following invisible channels, worn by centuries of previous travelers, carrying goods and knowledge and stories between distant oases of possibility. Movement as meditation, travel as prayer, each step an act of faith in the accumulated wisdom of people who had learned to dance with impossibility and somehow, miraculously, survive it. Food becomes philosophy when scarcity strips away everything except what actually keeps you alive. Not the complex cuisine of abundance, not the elaborate dishes of people who have choices, but nourishment reduced to its absolute essence. Calories that can endure extremes, nutrients that can sustain life when life itself hangs by the thinnest threads. The Bedouin pantry would seem impossibly austere to modern eyes accustomed to supermarket abundance. Dates, dried meat, fermented dairy, grains that could survive storage in conditions that would spoil nearly everything else. Food as medicine, sustenance as strategy, every meal a careful calculation in the ongoing arithmetic of survival. Dates became their primary currency of energy, concentrated sweetness that could restore blood sugar depleted by desert heat and constant travel. Not just food, but portable power sources that weighed almost nothing and provided the quick energy needed for sudden exertion. Setting up camp in sandstorms, dealing with emergencies, maintaining alertness during the dangerous hours when mistakes could prove fatal. But dates were more than fuel. They were water conservation, containing enough moisture to reduce the constant thirst that plagued desert travelers. Natural electrolytes that helped bodies maintain the sodium balance essential for surviving in extreme heat. Fiber that kept digestive systems functioning normally when water was too precious to waste on elaborate food preparation. Dried meat, jerky elevated to art form through techniques perfected over generations of people who understood that protein spoilage meant death. Not just dehydrated flesh, but carefully seasoned, perfectly preserved nutrition that could last for months without refrigeration. Meat that retained enough fat to provide essential calories, while being lean enough to avoid rancidity in extreme heat. The salt that preserved this meat came from the desert itself, mined from ancient seabeds where prehistoric oceans had evaporated and left behind crystalline treasure, salt that was precious as silver, traded across impossible distances, valued not just for flavor, but for its essential role in keeping human bodies functional in conditions that constantly depleted sodium through sweat and stress. Fermented mares, milk, kumis, represented the ultimate in portable dairy, cultured to survive temperatures that would spoil regular milk in hours. Slight alcohol content that provided calories, while the fermentation process created probiotics essential for digestive health when other sources of beneficial bacteria were unavailable. Liquid nutrition that could be consumed even when solid food became difficult to manage. Cooking methods that required minimal water became necessity-driven innovation. Solar cooking using focused sunlight and dark rocks. Underground cooking using heat retained in sand from the day's blazing temperatures. Techniques that conserved fuel, conserved water, conserved energy, while still producing food that could sustain life under impossible conditions. The social rituals of shared scarcity created bonds stronger than abundance ever could. How to divide insufficient food fairly among people whose lives depended on each other's survival. The mathematics of hospitality when offering food to strangers meant literally giving away portions of your own life expectancy. Generosity as survival strategy, kindness as practical insurance. They learned which desert plants could supplement their austere diet during the brief seasons when rain created temporary abundance. Roots that could be ground into flour. Leaves that provided essential vitamins. Seeds and nuts that appeared for just a few weeks but could be gathered and stored for months of lean eating ahead. Water discipline extended to food preparation in ways that would challenge modern cooks. Meals that required no washing. Cooking methods that produced no dishes to clean. Food preparation that conserved every drop of moisture while still creating nourishment that could restore strength and morale after days of deprivation. The psychology of feast and famine shaped their entire relationship with food. How to eat during the rare times of abundance without making themselves sick after extended periods of careful rationing. How to maintain hope and social cohesion during stretches when everyone was constantly hungry but had to keep functioning at levels that demanded significant physical and mental energy. Spice became medicine when medical resources were limited to what could be carried across vast distances. Not just flavor enhancement, but practical pharmacology. Herbs that aided digestion, spices that helped preserve food, seasonings that provided nutrients missing from their austere basic diet. Every pinch of seasoning justified by survival value as much as taste. Emergency food protocols for when already limited supplies ran dangerously low. Which foods to consume first, which to save for absolute emergencies. How to stretch insufficient nutrition across longer periods than should have been possible. The grim calculations of survival rationing when the next resupply might be days or weeks away. Food storage in extreme conditions required techniques that modern food science is still studying. Underground caches that stayed cool even during blazing summer days. Protective containers that kept supplies safe from insects, rodents, and the constant infiltration of sand that could contaminate provisions and make them inedible. The art of eating slowly, of making small portions last longer through careful consumption rather than wasteful gulping. Not just table manners, but survival technique, extracting maximum nutritional and psychological satisfaction from minimal quantities of food. Meals as meditation, consumption as conservation practice, seasonal eating that followed the harsh calendar of desert life, different foods for different challenges, high energy provisions for travel days, easy to digest options for recovery from illness or extreme exertion, comfort foods that provided psychological sustenance when physical conditions became almost unbearable. They understood something we've forgotten in our age of refrigerated abundance, that food is relationship. Relationship with the animals that provided meat and milk. Relationship with the plants that produced dates and grains. Relationship with the other humans who shared the constant awareness that every meal might be precious in ways that comfortable. people never have to consider. Still better than that airline food, right? But joking aside, their relationship with food contained wisdom that goes far beyond survival technique. They learned to find satisfaction in simplicity, to discover flavor in foods that had been stripped of everything except nutritional necessity, to create the social bonds that made harsh conditions bearable through the simple act of sharing whatever they had. Every meal was gratitude made edible, appreciation transformed into the simple act of consumption, not taking anything for granted because nothing could be taken for granted, finding joy in sustenance because sustenance itself was never guaranteed, always earned, always precious. But water was only the beginning, because to live where the sun could cook stone, they had to understand something deeper. They had to learn the language of heat itself. Clothing becomes climate control when the difference between dressed and dead is measured in degrees. Not fashion, not comfort, not the casual choices of people who live in air-conditioned abundance, but textile engineering designed to create portable microclimates that keep human bodies functional in temperatures that should kill them. The first time you see Bedouin robes, your modern instincts scream that they're doing it wrong. Dark colors under blazing sun. Heavy fabric when you can barely breathe. Layer upon layer when your impulse is to strip down to nothing. But your instincts would kill you in the desert, and their counterintuitive wisdom has kept people alive for thousands of years. Black robes in white heat. Dark fabric that absorbs the sun's radiation, yes, but creates the temperature differentials that make air move. And moving air, even hot air, is what saves you. The physics of convection turned into wearable technology. Hot air rises away from your body, pulling cooler air up from below, creating circulation patterns that turn your clothing into a personal cooling system. The layers work like thermal engineering, not trapping heat, but managing it, channeling it, using the properties of different fabrics to create zones of relative comfort, even when the ambient temperature could literally cook an egg. Loose outer robes that create air gaps, fitted undergarments that wick moisture away from skin, head coverings that provide shade while allowing heat to escape through carefully designed openings. Watch how the fabric moves as they walk. This isn't clothing hanging dead against the body, but textiles that breathe and flow and pulse with each step, each breath, each subtle movement that helps air circulate through the complex system of layers. Clothing that lives, that participates actively in the work of keeping its wearer alive. The weave matters as much as the color, not too tight. Air needs to move through the fabric itself, allowing evaporation to cool the cloth while it cools the skin beneath. Not too loose. Sand and dust will penetrate the layers and create the kind of abrasion that can turn simple walking into torture. Just the right permeability, the perfect balance between protection and ventilation. Head coverings become portable, shade systems, creating shadow that moves with you across landscapes where no other shade exists. But more than simple shade, thermal regulators that protect the brain from overheating while allowing heat generated by the body to escape through the scalp. Complex wrapping techniques that can be adjusted throughout the day as temperatures and conditions change. Natural fibers chosen not just for availability, but for their specific properties under extreme conditions. Cotton that absorbs moisture and releases it slowly for cooling. Wool that insulates in unexpected directions, keeping body heat stable rather than allowing the wild temperature swings that can shock human physiology into failure. Linen that breathes in ways that synthetic fabrics still can't match. The social engineering of clothing choices extends beyond individual comfort to group dynamics. How to dress so that shared spaces remain comfortable for everyone. How to manage the thermal loads of multiple people living in close proximity when everyone's clothing choices affect everyone else's microclimate. Collective wisdom about fabrics and colors that work best for different seasons and different kinds of desert travel. Clothing maintenance in conditions where water is too precious to waste on washing becomes its own survival skill. How to keep fabrics clean and functional using sand, sunlight, and air circulation rather than soap and water. Techniques for managing the constant infiltration of dust and grit that can turn protective clothing into sources of irritation and injury. The psychological comfort of proper desert clothing goes beyond physical protection. How the weight and texture of familiar fabrics provides emotional security when everything else about your environment is hostile and uncertain. The way traditional robes move and sound becomes part of the sensory experience that helps people maintain mental equilibrium under extreme stress. Emergency clothing protocols for when the protective systems fail. How to improvise head coverings from available materials. How to modify existing garments when temperatures become even more extreme than expected. How to share clothing resources when group members lose or damage their protective gear. Layering strategies that can be adjusted throughout the daily temperature cycles that define desert life. Light layers for the heat of midday. Additional insulation for the surprising cold of desert nights. Intermediate configurations for the transitional hours of dawn and dusk when temperatures change rapidly and clothing needs to adapt quickly. The art of dressing for movement across varied terrain and changing conditions. Garments that protect during sandstorms but don't impede walking. Fabrics that provide sun protection without causing overheating during physical exertion. Clothing systems that can transition from travel mode to rest mode to emergency mode as circumstances demand. They understood something about the relationship between covering and cooling that seems paradoxical to people accustomed to stripping down when temperatures rise. More clothing can mean cooler body temperature if that clothing is designed correctly, worn properly, and integrated into a complete system of thermal management that includes behavior, timing, and environmental awareness. The economics of clothing, in environments where replacement is impossible, became part of survival planning. How to choose garments that could last for months or years of harsh use. How to repair and maintain textiles when new clothing might not be available until the next major trading season. How to make clothing choices that balanced immediate comfort against long-term durability. Color symbolism in desert clothing went beyond practical considerations to include social and spiritual meanings. Dark colors that connected wearers to the night sky and the coolness it promised. Earth tones that helped travelers blend with the landscape and avoid unwanted attention. White accents that reflected specific kinds of light while allowing others to be absorbed for heating. The strange intimacy of clothing that literally keeps you alive creates different relationships with textiles than people in comfortable climates can understand. These aren't just garments, but life support systems that you trust with your survival. Fabrics that become extensions of your skin, protective shells that mediate between your fragile human body and an environment that wants to kill you. And maybe you understand this, how sometimes wrapping up tight is what makes you feel free. How protection can create the security that allows for movement. How the right barriers between yourself and the world can paradoxically give you more freedom to engage with that world on your own terms. The desert taught them that exposure isn't always liberation, that sometimes the path to comfort leads through apparent discomfort, that counterintuitive choices often contain the deepest wisdom. Lessons written in fabric and worn against the skin, carried across impossible distances by people who learned to dress for survival and found, in that dressing, a kind of grace. Trade becomes lifeline when isolation means death, not the comfortable commerce of people with choices, not the casual exchange of wants and preferences, but the deadly serious business of moving essential goods across distances that kill the unprepared, through conditions that turn profit margins into matters of life and death. Desert cities bloomed like impossible flowers in places where nothing should grow, sustained by the strange economics of scarcity that made certain goods precious as life itself. Oasis towns that existed solely because someone had figured out how to make survival profitable, how to turn the harsh mathematics of desert crossing into sustainable business models that could support permanent settlement. Spices worth more than gold, not metaphorically, literally. Cardamom and cinnamon and black pepper that justified risking lives across waterless wastes, because the profit margins on luxury goods could absorb the enormous costs of desert transportation. Ounces of seasoning that could pay for entire caravans. Flavoring that was precious enough to make merchants willing to bet their lives on successful crossing. But the most valuable cargo was often information. Knowledge of which routes were safe during which seasons, which water sources had failed or been discovered, which political situations had changed the safety calculations for different trading paths. Information that travelers would share or sell or trade for other knowledge that might keep them alive on their next journey. The social contracts that made desert trading possible went far beyond simple business agreements. These were mutual, survival pacts, elaborate systems of reciprocal obligation that ensured travelers could find assistance at crucial points along routes that stretched across impossible distances. Not just economic relationships, but life insurance policies written in tradition and honor. Hospitality became the foundation of desert economics, not generosity, but investment in survival infrastructure. Providing food and shelter and protection to strangers wasn't charity, it was maintaining the network of mutual aid that made long-distance desert travel possible for anyone. Today's guest might be tomorrow's rescuer. Today's host might be tomorrow's stranded traveler needing assistance. Credit systems developed that could span months of travel time and thousands of miles of dangerous territory. Merchants extending goods and services to traders who wouldn't be able to pay until they reached distant markets, trusting in reputation and relationship networks that stretched across the known world. Financial instruments that required trust levels impossible in less dangerous environments. The economics of water created the strangest markets in human history. Not just buying and selling liquid, but complex negotiations around access to wells, rights to oasis use, payments for information about seasonal water availability. Pricing structures that factored in not just supply and demand, but the probability that caravans would survive to complete their transactions. Emergency economics, for when the normal trading relationships broke down, barter systems that could function when currency became meaningless, value assessments that could be made quickly when time was running out, negotiation protocols that could establish fair exchanges between strangers who might never see each other again, but whose immediate survival depended on successful deals. Pack animals became the foundation of desert economics, not just transportation, but the limiting factor that determined what kinds of trade were possible across different routes. Camels that could carry specific weights across specific distances, requiring specific amounts of water and food, creating the basic mathematical constraints within which all desert commerce had to operate. The seasonal rhythms of desert trade followed patterns dictated by weather, water availability, and the complex logistics of moving goods across terrain that was deadly during some months and merely difficult during others. Trading seasons that compressed months of economic activity into brief windows when conditions made long-distance travel possible. Risk assessment became the core skill of desert merchants, not just evaluating market conditions, but calculating survival probabilities, weather patterns, political stability, and the dozens of variables that could turn profitable ventures into disasters that wiped out entire trading enterprises, along with everyone involved in them. The social status of successful desert traders reflected not just wealth, but survival, skills, navigation abilities, and the kind of practical wisdom that kept people alive in conditions where making mistakes meant dying. Merchant princes who had earned their positions not just through business acumen, but through demonstrated competence at the deadly serious work of desert crossing. Insurance systems developed around the shared understanding that desert trading involved risks that could destroy entire expeditions. Mutual aid societies, shared cargo arrangements, and complex partnership structures that distributed risks across multiple participants so that single disasters couldn't wipe out everyone involved in a trading venture. The markets that emerged at major oasis towns became temporary cities, complex social organisms that appeared for brief trading seasons then dissolved as caravans departed for distant destinations. Economic communities that had to establish rules, resolve disputes, and maintain order despite being composed entirely of temporary residents who might never meet again. Quality control for goods that had to survive months of transport under extreme conditions became its own specialty, not just evaluating products for immediate value, but assessing their ability to endure the kinds of abuse that came with desert transport: heat, cold, dust, moisture, rough handling, and the constant vibration of camelback travel. Currency. Systems had to account for the practical limitations of desert travel. Coins and precious metals that were portable enough for long-distance transport, but valuable enough to justify their weight in cargo capacity. Trade goods that could serve as currency while also having practical value for survival or commerce at destination markets. The strange phenomenon of desert boom towns. Settlements that appeared around successful water sources or favorable trade route intersections grew rapidly as commerce developed, then sometimes disappeared just as quickly when conditions changed or better routes were discovered. Economic communities that existed in constant awareness of their own impermanence. They created abundance from nothing, while we create nothing from abundance. Desert economics operated on principles that seem impossible to people accustomed to stable infrastructure and predictable supply chains, profit margins that had to justify risking everything, business relationships that required trust levels that could literally mean the difference between life and death. The legacy of desert trading routes shaped the development of entire civilizations, creating the economic networks that connected distant parts of the world long before modern transportation made such connections seem routine. Commerce that required crossing impossible distances, dealing with extremes of climate and terrain, navigating political boundaries and cultural differences that could turn simple transactions into complex international negotiations. But perhaps, most remarkably, these economic systems created incentives for cooperation across tribal, religious, and cultural boundaries that might otherwise have led to conflict. Trade relationships that made strangers into partners. Economic interdependence that created practical reasons for maintaining peace and mutual assistance across vast networks of desert settlements and trading posts. The mathematics of survival transformed into the algebra of prosperity, scarcity converted into systems of exchange that could sustain not just individual survival, but entire civilizations built on the foundation of successful desert commerce. Healing becomes improvisation when the nearest doctor is 1,000 miles away and your pharmacy is whatever grows in places where nothing should live. Not the comfortable medicine of people with hospitals and insurance, but the desperate ingenuity of treating ailments with whatever materials the desert provides to those who know how to look. The Bedouin medicine chest would seem impossibly sparse. To modern eyes accustomed to stocked pharmacies and specialist treatments, a handful of desert plants, some mineral compounds gathered from salt flats and rock formations. Traditional knowledge passed down through generations of people who learned that healing in the desert meant working with whatever the harsh landscape offered to those skilled, enough to find it. Plants that thrive where nothing should live often contain the most potent medicines, concentrated healing compounds developed through evolutionary pressure that mirrors the human struggle to survive in impossible conditions. Roots that dig deeper than trees at all, storing nutrients and medicinal compounds that can sustain both plant and human life during the harshest seasons. Desert sage that could treat digestive ailments common among people eating preserved foods and drinking water that wasn't always clean. Bitter compounds that killed intestinal parasites and bacteria. Natural antibiotics hidden in leaves tough enough to survive blazing heat and months without rain. Medicine disguised as weeds. Healing hidden in plants most people would dismiss as worthless scrub. The healing properties of desert minerals became crucial knowledge for people who couldn't carry heavy medical supplies across vast distances. Salt compounds that could clean wounds and prevent infection. Clay that could draw toxins from snake bites and scorpion stings. Crystalline formations that could be ground into powders for treating everything from eye infections to digestive disorders. Sand baths for joint pain and muscle stiffness, developed not from luxury spa treatments, but from practical necessity. The dry heat of sun-warmed sand providing therapeutic benefits for people whose bodies were constantly stressed by extreme conditions and physical demands that would challenge modern athletes. Desert physiotherapy using materials available everywhere and costing nothing except knowledge. Psychological medicine became as important as physical treatment in environments where mental stress could impair judgment in ways that proved fatal. Meditation techniques that weren't spiritual practices, but practical tools for managing the constant awareness of danger, the persistent discomfort, the social tensions that arose when groups of people lived in close proximity under survival conditions. Fasting as medical treatment made practical sense in environments where food was scarce and digestive systems were constantly challenged by preserved foods, uncertain water quality, and the physiological stress of extreme temperatures. Therapeutic hunger that gave overworked digestive systems time to recover while conserving food resources for when they would be most needed. The therapeutic power of endless silence offered healing opportunities unavailable in busier environments. Mental rest that came from environments so quiet you could hear your own heartbeat, so vast that personal problems gained perspective from being experienced against the backdrop of infinite space and geological timescales. Emergency medical protocols for conditions that were common hazards of desert life. Heat exhaustion treatments, using available materials and techniques that could be implemented without modern medical equipment. Dehydration management that went beyond simply drinking water to include electrolyte balance and the complex physiology of recovery from severe fluid loss. Wound care in environments where infection could be deadly and sterile conditions were impossible to maintain. Desert antiseptics derived from plants and minerals. Bandaging techniques using available textiles. Healing practices that worked with the body's natural recovery processes rather than against the challenging conditions that made healing difficult. The social aspects of desert medicine included community care systems that ensured sick or injured travelers weren't abandoned when groups had to keep moving to survive. Medical knowledge shared freely because anyone's expertise might be needed to save anyone else's life. Cooperation in healthcare that transcended normal social and economic boundaries. Pain management without modern pharmaceuticals required techniques that addressed both physical discomfort and the psychological challenges of enduring suffering while maintaining the mental clarity needed for survival. Traditional practices that helped people function despite injuries or illnesses that would disable them in more comfortable environments. Preventive medicine took priority in environments where treating serious illness was difficult or impossible. Dietary practices that maintained health under stressful conditions. Hygiene techniques that worked without abundant water. Lifestyle modifications that reduced the risk of developing conditions that could prove fatal when advanced medical care was unavailable. The diagnostic skills required for desert medicine had to work without modern testing equipment or laboratory analysis. Reading symptoms in context of environmental stresses, distinguishing between conditions that required immediate treatment and those that could wait, making medical decisions with incomplete information when the consequences of wrong choices could be deadly. Herbal preparations that could be made with minimal equipment and stored for long periods without refrigeration. Medical compounds that could survive the temperature extremes and rough handling that came with desert travel. Healing preparations that remained potent despite conditions that would destroy most modern medications. Childbirth and infant care in desert environments required specialized knowledge that ensured survival for both mothers and babies under conditions that would challenge modern obstetric care. traditional practices that maximize the chances of successful outcomes when medical intervention was limited to whatever skilled attendants could provide using available resources. The strange relationship between suffering and healing that developed in environments where pain was constant but had to be endured while maintaining full functionality. Desert medicine that acknowledged discomfort as normal while still addressing conditions that required treatment, accepting some level of ongoing hardship while focusing medical attention on truly serious threats to survival. They learned early, what we're still learning, that the world doesn't owe us comfort, but that human beings possess remarkable abilities to adapt, heal, and maintain function under conditions that seem impossible from the perspective of easier lives. Desert medicine as testimony to human resilience, healing practices that demonstrated how much the body and mind can endure while still finding ways to repair and strengthen themselves. Maybe we've forgotten that sometimes less really is more. Fewer medical interventions, but deeper understanding of how bodies heal naturally. Fewer pharmaceutical options, but greater knowledge of environmental healing factors. Fewer complex treatments, but more sophisticated understanding of how human beings can maintain health under challenging conditions. The medicine of emptiness taught them that healing often comes not from adding treatments, but from removing obstacles to the body's natural recovery processes, creating conditions where resilience can operate rather than trying to force improvement through external interventions. Navigation becomes intimacy when stars are your only friends in landscapes that offer no landmarks, no road signs, no familiar references to tell you which direction leads toward life and which toward emptiness that goes on forever. Not casual stargazing, not the romantic astronomy of people with GPS backups, but celestial navigation as life or death necessity in places where getting lost means dying slowly under an indifferent sky. The night desert reveals the universe in its full, overwhelming glory. Stars that city dwellers never see. Constellations so bright they cast shadows. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light that seems close enough to drink from. But this isn't beauty for beauty's sake. This is the most sophisticated navigation system ever developed, natural GPS written in fire across the darkness. Bedouin star knowledge went far beyond simple constellation identification. They memorized the movements of individual stars throughout the night, the seasonal changes in celestial positions, the precise relationships between stellar positions and compass directions that could guide travelers across featureless terrain, where a few degrees of error could mean missing your destination by hundreds of miles. Each star became a road sign in their mental maps of the sky, not just Polaris pointing north, but dozens of navigation stars that indicated specific directions at specific times of night during specific seasons. A celestial roadmap so complex it required years to master, so precise it could guide caravans across vast distances with accuracy that would impress modern navigators. The poetry of naming constellations reflected not just imagination, but practical memory techniques for preserving navigation knowledge across generations. Stories attached to star patterns weren't entertainment but educational tools, narrative structures that helped people remember the complex relationships between celestial positions and terrestrial directions. Astronomy disguised as mythology, survival skills embedded in storytelling. Time-telling by stellar movement created clocks more reliable than any mechanical timepiece, natural chronometers that never broke down or required winding. The slow procession of stars across the night sky marked not just hours, but the optimal timing for travel, rest, and the dozens of survival activities that had to be coordinated with temperature cycles and daylight availability. But desert astronomy was more than just navigation technology. The shocking cold that followed blazing day created conditions where star observation was not just possible, but essential for survival. Nights so clear that atmospheric distortion disappeared, revealing celestial details invisible from more humid climates. conditions that made every clear night a masterclass in practical astronomy. The silence that accompanied star navigation was unlike any quiet most people ever experience. Not just the absence of human noise, but the deep stillness that comes from being hundreds of miles from any mechanical sound, any electrical hum, any sign of technological civilization. Silence so complete you could hear your pulse, your breathing, the subtle sounds of your own body maintaining life in the vast emptiness. Navigation by star patterns required mental skills that seem almost superhuman to people accustomed to digital navigation aids. Three-dimensional thinking that could track multiple celestial objects simultaneously. Mathematical calculations performed in your head while walking across shifting sand in darkness. Memory techniques that could maintain accuracy over weeks or months of continuous travel. The social aspects of stellar navigation included teaching systems that ensured multiple members of any traveling group possessed backup navigation skills. Knowledge shared not just for redundancy, but because star reading improved with multiple observers comparing their observations and calculations. Collective astronomy that made groups smarter than any individual navigator could be alone. Emergency navigation protocols for when normal star navigation became impossible due to sandstorms, cloud cover, or other conditions that obscured celestial references. Alternative techniques using wind patterns, ground texture, and the subtle environmental cues that experienced travelers could read, even when the sky provided no guidance. The intimate relationship between navigator and night sky created bonds that went beyond simple utility. Stars that became familiar as old friends. Celestial landmarks that provided not just directional guidance but psychological comfort during long nights of uncertain travel. Astronomy as companionship, stellar navigation as conversation with the cosmos. Reading wind patterns in sand formations provided terrestrial navigation backup when celestial observation was impossible. The way wind carved specific patterns in dunes and rock formations, creating ground-level indicators that could supplement or replace star-based direction finding. Environmental reading that turned the entire landscape into a navigation aid for those who knew how to interpret its subtle messages. Animal tracks as directional signs required understanding the behavioral patterns of desert wildlife. The routes animals followed between feeding and watering areas. The seasonal migrations that created temporary pathways across otherwise trackless terrain. Biological navigation that used other species' survival knowledge to supplement human wayfinding techniques. The memory palaces, built from landscape features, helped navigators maintain mental maps of routes that might not be traveled again for months or years. Psychological techniques for organizing spatial information, associating navigation landmarks with memorable images or stories that could be recalled accurately after long intervals. Mental cartography that created internal maps more detailed than any physical chart. Existential navigation emerged from the psychological challenges of traveling across spaces so vast that human importance became almost theoretical. Mental techniques for maintaining purpose and direction when surrounded by emptiness that seemed to go on forever. Psychological tools for managing the strange combination of isolation and responsibility that came with guiding others across impossible distances. The mathematics of stellar navigation included calculations that had to account for the movement of both observer and celestial objects, the effects of atmospheric refraction on apparent star positions, the seasonal changes in visible constellations that altered available navigation references throughout the year. Astronomy as applied mathematics performed without instruments under conditions where errors could prove fatal. Star navigation created relationships with time and space that were fundamentally different from modern experiences of travel and location. Movement measured not in miles per hour, but in stellar degrees per night. Progress calculated against the slow rotation of the celestial sphere, rather than against mechanical clocks or digital displays. The confidence required for stellar navigation went beyond simple faith in technique to include acceptance of the awesome responsibility that came with guiding others across landscapes where navigation errors could doom entire groups. Mental discipline that could maintain accuracy and judgment under the pressure of knowing that other people's lives depended on your astronomical calculations. And maybe that's what we're all doing, isn't it? Following stars, hoping they lead somewhere good. Using whatever guidance we can find to navigate across spaces that seem impossibly vast. Trusting in knowledge passed down from people who learned to find their way when everything familiar disappeared, and only the most distant lights remained to show the path forward. The astronomy of loneliness taught them that sometimes the most distant things provide the most reliable guidance. That navigation requires looking up rather than down, that finding your way often means accepting your smallness under the infinite sky while still maintaining the confidence to keep moving toward whatever destination lies beyond the horizon. Faith becomes physics when belief is the difference between endurance and collapse, between maintaining hope across impossible distances and surrendering to the mathematical certainty that you probably won't survive what you're attempting. Not comfortable religion practiced in safe buildings, but spiritual. Disciplines forged in extremity, tested daily against conditions that strip away everything except what actually sustains human life. Prayer times aligned with survival needs weren't coincidence, but practical wisdom disguised as religious observance. Dawn prayers that began before the day's heat could build to dangerous levels. Midday prayers that enforced rest during the hours when movement meant death. Evening prayers that marked the safe return of temperatures cool enough for resumed travel. Spiritual schedule that synchronized with the thermal rhythms of desert survival. The sacred directions of prayer created navigation references that supplemented astronomical wayfinding, religious orientation that served double duty as directional, confirmation for travelers who needed every possible method of maintaining accurate headings across featureless terrain, faith pointing toward Mecca, also pointing toward survival for people whose lives depended on not getting lost. Pilgrimage routes across impossible terrain represented the ultimate integration of spiritual purpose with survival expertise, religious journeys that required mastery of every desert survival skill, while adding the additional challenge of traveling with large groups of people who might not possess the knowledge needed to keep themselves alive in extreme conditions. The communal strength of shared belief created social bonds that went beyond normal group cohesion to include willingness to sacrifice individual safety for collective survival, spiritual commitment that made people willing to share scarce resources and support struggling companions, even when self-preservation instincts suggested abandoning the weak to save the strong. Meditation practices born from necessity weren't mystical exercises, but practical psychological tools for managing the constant awareness of danger, the persistent discomfort, the mental stress that came from living always at the edge of human physiological limits. Spiritual disciplines that kept minds clear when confused thinking could prove fatal. Fasting as spiritual practice made perfect sense in environments where food scarcity was normal and appetite had to be managed through mental discipline, rather than simply eating whenever hunger arose. Religious fasting that trained people in the psychological skills needed for surviving extended periods of involuntary hunger while maintaining physical and mental function. The desert as place of revelation reflected not just religious tradition, but the psychological reality that extreme conditions create states of consciousness unavailable in comfortable environments. Spiritual insights that emerge naturally from the combination of physical stress, social isolation, and the awesome perspective that comes from experiencing human smallness against infinite landscapes. Sacred sites in the middle of nowhere marked not just religious significance, but practical waypoints for desert travelers. Spiritual landmarks that provided psychological comfort while serving as navigation references and rest stops for people crossing vast distances between more substantial settlements. Religion as infrastructure for survival. Silence as pathway to the divine wasn't poetic metaphor, but accurate description of the meditative states that naturally arose from environments where quiet was so complete it became almost tangible. Spiritual practice that required no special techniques, because the desert itself created conditions conducive to deep contemplation and prayer. The social engineering of religious community in extreme conditions included conflict resolution mechanisms that could maintain group cohesion when survival stress created tensions that might otherwise tear traveling communities apart. Spiritual authority that could settle disputes quickly before they escalated to violence that could doom everyone involved. Hospitality laws that superseded tribal conflicts weren't just moral idealism, but practical survival insurance, religious obligations that created networks of mutual aid spanning potential enemies who might need each other's assistance when faced with conditions that threatened everyone equally, regardless of their political or cultural differences. Suffering as spiritual teacher emerged naturally from environments where pain was constant, but had to be endured while maintaining full functionality. Religious frameworks that helped people find meaning in discomfort. Spiritual disciplines that transformed survival challenges into opportunities for developing wisdom and character strength. The economics of religious obligation in survival contexts included tithing and charity systems adapted to conditions where giving away resources might literally mean giving away life expectancy. Spiritual generosity that had to be balanced against practical survival needs without abandoning the community support that made group survival possible. Ritual purity, practices modified for conditions where water was too precious to use for ceremonial washing, religious cleanliness that had to be maintained through alternative methods that preserved spiritual observance while conserving liquid needed for survival. Faith adapted to scarcity without abandoning essential principles. The theological implications of survival situations that tested religious faith against immediate physical needs. Spiritual beliefs that had to address questions about divine providence when faced with conditions that seemed designed to kill believers along with everyone else. Desert theology that found God not in comfort but in extremity. Seasonal religious observances that had to account for the practical limitations of desert life. Religious calendars that synchronized spiritual celebrations with survival schedules. Holiday observances that maintained community traditions while adapting to conditions where normal festive practices might prove impossible or dangerous. The psychology of group prayer under survival conditions created social cohesion that went beyond normal religious community to include the kind of mutual dependence that made people willing to risk their lives for strangers who shared their faith and their immediate danger. Spiritual bonds forged in shared extremity. Religious education that embedded survival knowledge in spiritual instruction. Teaching methods that preserved practical wisdom within religious frameworks. Spiritual texts that contained encoded information about navigation, weather prediction, and resource management disguised as religious stories and moral instruction. The role of religious leadership in survival groups included not just spiritual guidance, but practical decision-making authority that could coordinate group activities, settle resource disputes, and maintain morale during extended periods of extreme hardship when normal social structures might break down under survival stress. Why comfortable people rarely find God became apparent in desert conditions that stripped away all the distractions and conveniences that normally occupy human attention. Spiritual clarity that emerged naturally when survival became the primary focus, and everything else became secondary to the basic challenge of staying alive. And in your own comfort tonight, maybe you can touch that same silence they found. Not the complete quiet of desert nights, but whatever peace is available in your own circumstances. The spiritual disciplines they developed weren't just for extreme conditions, but contained wisdom applicable to any situation that requires endurance, faith, and the kind of hope that can sustain people through difficulties that seem impossible to overcome. The rituals of resilience they created weren't just religious practices, but comprehensive systems for maintaining human dignity and community bonds under conditions that challenged every assumption about what people could endure while still remaining fully human. Faith as survival tool, spirituality as practical wisdom, religion as the framework that could hold communities together when everything else fell apart. Their spiritual legacy suggests that the deepest religious insights often emerge not from comfort, but from confrontation with our limitations, not from abundance, but from scarcity, not from safety, but from the kind of danger that forces us to discover what we're actually made of when everything non-essential is stripped away. And in this ancient rhythm of survival, there were small voices learning the desert's language. Children whose first words weren't mama or dada, but the names of stars that would guide them home. Picture a 5-year-old girl, her tiny hands already steady as she watches her grandmother sort dates in the pre-dawn darkness. Her game isn't hopscotch or hide and seek. It's learning to tell sweet dates from bitter ones by touch alone, because someday her life might depend on choosing correctly in the dark. These children didn't play house. They played caravan. Their dolls weren't tucked into beds, but wrapped in miniature blankets that mimicked the precise way you bundle a sick camel to keep it alive through a sandstorm. Their songs weren't nursery rhymes about sheep. They were memory aids disguised as lullabies, encoding the locations of water sources 50 miles apart. Listen to how gently they learned the hardest truths. A 7-year-old boy asks his father, "Why can't we travel when the sun is high?" And his father doesn't frighten him with talk of death and heat stroke. Instead, he says, "The sun gets tired too, little one. When it's working hardest, we rest. When it rests, we work. We dance together." Their games had rules that would save lives. Tag became a lesson in reading wind direction. The child who was it had to run into the wind, learning that in a real sandstorm you always move against the wind to find clear air. Their version of follow the leader taught them to step in each other's footprints exactly, conserving energy and learning the rhythm of desert walking. At 8 years old, they could read their parents' faces like weather maps. A slight tightening around their mother's eyes meant water was getting low. Their father's particular way of squinting at the horizon meant he was calculating whether they could reach the next oasis before the weather turned. These children learned that survival often depended not on what was said, but on what remained unspoken. They came of age not with parties or ceremonies, but with their first solo journey to the nearest well. A walk that might be 3 hours through shifting sand, carrying only what they needed, trusting everything they'd learned. The moment they returned with full water skins, they'd crossed from childhood into the tribe of survivors. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about these desert children was how they learned to find wonder in the midst of hardship. They collected smooth stones worn by centuries of sand, not because they were pretty, but because each one told a story of endurance. They learned to spot the tiny desert flowers that bloomed for just one day after rain, teaching them that beauty is often brief but never meaningless. They learned early what we're still learning, that the world doesn't owe us comfort. But in learning this hard truth gently, they discovered something we often miss, that resilience isn't about becoming hard. It's about becoming flexible, like the desert grasses that bend with every wind, but never break, in a place that seems timeless, where every day brings the same blazing sun and every night the same shocking cold. The Bedouins learned to read the desert's subtle calendar, seasons written not in changing leaves, but in the angle of shadows and the behavior of wind. Spring in the desert wasn't marked by flowers. Well, not usually. It was the season of moving, when the heat hadn't yet become murderous and the wells were fullest from winter's rare rains. This was caravan season, when trade routes came alive with the sound of camel bells and human voices calling across the vastness. The Bedouins could tell spring was coming by the way their animals behaved. Camels grew restless, sensing the approaching, traveling season in ways humans couldn't explain. Goats gave richer milk. Even the desert foxes seemed more active in the pre-dawn hours, as if some invisible signal had been sent across the dunes. Summer was the season of stillness. This was when the desert showed its true face. When noon temperatures could kill an unprotected person in hours. When metal became too hot to touch. When the very air seemed to shimmer with danger. But even summer had its rhythms. The wise knew that summer mornings, those precious hours before sunrise, were when the desert was most generous. Night hunters returned with their prey. Night-blooming flowers opened their brief, perfect faces to the stars. Autumn brought the season of preparation. This was when every family checked their equipment obsessively, mending tears in tent fabric. That could mean the difference between life and death. Testing rope strength. Evaluating which camels were strong enough for the coming winter journeys. It was the season of teaching, when elders shared knowledge that might not be needed for months but could save lives when the time came. And winter. Winter was the desert's gift to those who understood its language. Temperatures that might still kill an unprepared traveler, but felt like relief to those who'd survived summer's fury. This was the season of long journeys, when it was possible to travel during daylight hours without dying, when the rare winter rains might fill hidden cisterns and create temporary oases that would disappear by spring. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about the desert seasons was how they taught patience. In our world, we measure time in minutes, hours, days. The Bedouins learned to think in seasons, years, even decades. A good location for a well might be remembered for 20 years before conditions were right to dig it. A trade route might be used once every few years, when political and weather conditions aligned perfectly. They understood something we've forgotten, that some things can't be rushed, that patience isn't passive waiting, but active preparation for the right moment. They watched the sky not for immediate answers, but for patterns that revealed themselves over months of observation. And as seasons turned like slow wheels, as time moved like sand through patient fingers, certain names began to rise above the endless dunes. Individuals whose mastery of desert life became legend, whose stories were told around fires for generations after their deaths. In the scorching summers of the 12th century, when even experienced desert guides refused to attempt the treacherous northern passages, there was one name whispered with reverence around the campfires of Damascus: Amina bint Rashid, the woman who could find water where maps showed only death. She was born to dust and destiny in a small trading family, raised on stories of stars and survival. Her grandfather had been a guide, her father a merchant. But Amina was something different. By age 15, she could read weather patterns 3 days in advance. By 20, she developed new methods for finding underground water that confounded even experienced well diggers. Picture her hands, weathered like ancient leather, holding a handful of sand to her nose and breathing in its story. These weren't the soft hands of a woman sheltered by wealth. These were tools calibrated by years of practice to detect moisture content, mineral traces, even the subtle scents that indicated which direction water lay. Her eyes held secrets too, eyes that could spot the almost invisible variations in sand, color that indicated underground streams, eyes that read the flight patterns of birds not just for weather prediction, but for navigation, following their paths to distant water sources that existed on no map. But it was her mind that made her legendary. While other guides memorized established routes, Amina created new ones. She mapped passages through the most hostile terrain, finding paths that cut days off dangerous journeys. Her routes weren't just faster, they were safer, utilizing her uncanny ability to predict where water would be found and when weather would turn deadly. The morning that made her reputation, she woke her caravan before dawn and announced they needed to change course immediately. The sky was clear, the wind calm, But something in the way the desert foxes had behaved the night before, something in the particular quality of the pre-dawn air, told her a sandstorm was building 3 days away. Her clients thought she was being overly cautious. 3 days later, that storm killed 17 people on the traditional route, while Amina's caravan rested safely in the shelter of hidden rocks she'd discovered years earlier. She wasn't just a guide, she was a teacher. Every journey became a classroom where she shared knowledge freely, understanding that desert wisdom belonged to all who needed it. Young men who traveled with her once returned home as accomplished guides themselves, carrying her techniques to new territories. Her reputation spread along trade routes like ripples across sand. Merchants would wait months for a chance to join one of her caravans. Pilgrims traveling to Mecca sought her out specifically, knowing that under her guidance, their spiritual journey would also be a safe one. In her later years, when age made the most difficult routes impossible, she established the first formal school for desert guides. In a simple stone building in an oasis town, she taught the next generation to read the desert's moods, to find water in apparent wasteland, to calculate risks that meant the difference between profit and death. She died as she lived, quietly, without fanfare, having spent her final years ensuring that her knowledge wouldn't die with her. Her students spread across the trade routes of 3 continents, carrying her wisdom like seeds on the wind. And even today, in some remote corners of the desert, old guides still speak of Amina's way when describing the perfect route through impossible terrain. There was once a man who owned 3 houses in Damascus, silk-draped apartments in Cairo, and warehouses full of spices from lands whose names he could barely pronounce. His rings were worth more than most families saw in a lifetime. His robes were woven from threads that had traveled further than most people would ever journey. His name was Hassan al-Tabir, though after what happened to him, he learned to answer to simply Abu, father, even though he had no children, because the desert has a way of stripping away everything unnecessary, including the names we use to remind ourselves of who we think we are. The betrayal came from his own brother. Business partnerships dissolved overnight, debts called in by people he'd trusted, accounts emptied by those he'd considered friends. Within a single week, Hassan al-Tabir went from merchant prince to a man with nothing but the expensive clothes on his back, and the bitter knowledge that wealth makes you many friends, but teaches you little about recognizing true ones. He fled into the desert not because he chose to, but because he had nowhere else to go. His soft hands, manicured for shaking hands with wealthy clients, now blistered on camel reins. His feet, accustomed to silk slippers on marble floors, learned to navigate burning sand in borrowed boots that didn't fit properly. The Bedouin tribe that found him could have left him to die, would have been justified in doing so, since he had nothing to offer them in return for their help. But they didn't. They fed him from their own meager supplies, shared their water when every drop was precious, taught him the skills he needed to survive in this place that cared nothing for his former status. And slowly, something beautiful happened. The man who had spent his life accumulating possessions learned the joy of needing almost nothing. The hands that had once counted gold coins learned to milk camels, to repair torn fabric, to find satisfaction in simple tasks done well. The mind that had calculated profit margins learned to read weather patterns, to understand the desert's moods, to find peace in vast silence. Within a year, he was traveling with the tribe as an equal. Within 2 years, he was helping to plan their routes. His merchant's understanding of supply and demand now applied to the crucial calculus of desert survival. Within 3 years, he'd earned a new name, not given by himself, but bestowed by others who recognized his transformation. But here's the remarkable thing. When he eventually re-established contact with the trading world, when his knowledge of desert routes and customs made him valuable to merchants again, he didn't try to regain his former life. Instead, he used his rebuilt wealth differently. He funded watering stations along dangerous routes. He established rest houses where travelers could recover from difficult journeys. He invested in the infrastructure of hospitality that the desert demanded. His former associates, when they met him again, barely recognized him. The soft-bodied man in expensive robes had been replaced by someone lean and weathered, whose eyes held the particular calm that comes from having survived the worst and found it bearable. His hands, now permanently marked by desert work, moved with a new kind of precision. He never returned to Damascus permanently. Instead, he spent his remaining years moving between the world of commerce and the world of sand, serving as a bridge between those who had everything and those who needed so little. He understood both languages now, the language of profit and the language of survival, the currency of gold and the currency of trust. When he died, it was in a tent rather than a palace, surrounded by Bedouin friends rather than business associates. His wealth was distributed, according to desert law, not to blood relatives who had betrayed him, but to the community that had saved him. And perhaps most fitting of all, his grave marker bore not his birth name, but the simple desert title he'd earned, Abu Karam, Father of Generosity. In 1967, when the first paved road cut across the Rub al-Khali desert, an elderly Bedouin, woman named Fatima bint Saad, sat in the shade of her granddaughter's modern house and wept. Not from sadness exactly, but from the particular grief that comes from watching a world you understand being replaced by one you don't. She was the last, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back perhaps 1,000 years. Her grandmother had taught her the songs that contained navigation instructions, melodies that disguised maps, rhythms that matched the pace of desert walking. Her mother had shown her how to read weather in the behavior of insects, how to predict sandstorms by the way smoke rose from cooking fires. Fatima's hands held the memory of skills that were becoming obsolete with startling speed. She could weave tent fabric so tightly it would turn away sand-laden wind, but still allow air to circulate. She could prepare leather water containers that would keep water cool even in brutal heat. She knew which stars to follow during which seasons, which plants could treat which ailments, how to deliver a baby camel when the mother was too weak to help. But more than technique, she carried stories that were textbooks disguised as entertainment, teaching tales that contained survival information essential for desert life. Each story had layers, enjoyable for children, instructional for adolescents, profound for adults who understood the deeper meanings. As modern life crept into the desert, as young people left for cities with electric lights and steady jobs, Fatima found herself becoming a living museum. Anthropologists came to interview her, recording her knowledge on machines she didn't understand. Government officials asked her to demonstrate traditional crafts for cultural festivals, turning survival skills into tourist attractions. But what hurt most wasn't being treated like a relic. It was watching knowledge disappear because no one thought they needed it anymore. When GPS devices could tell you exactly where you were, why learn to navigate by stars? When trucks could carry unlimited water, why master the art of rationing? When weather services could broadcast storm warnings, why develop the ability to read approaching danger in cloud formations? Yet Fatima persisted with quiet stubbornness. She taught anyone who would learn, from curious grandchildren to visiting researchers. She demonstrated traditional weaving to women who would rather buy factory-made textiles. She shared medicinal plant knowledge with young people who trusted modern doctors more than ancient remedies. Her greatest worry wasn't for herself. She'd lived her life fully, mastering skills her ancestors would have recognized and respected. Her worry was for the generation that would inherit a world where traditional knowledge had been lost, where people had become so dependent on modern technology that they'd forgotten how to survive without it. In her final years, she made it her mission to record as much as possible. She worked with her educated granddaughter to write down recipes, remedies, and techniques that had never existed in written form before. She sang old songs into recording devices, hoping someone in the future would understand their hidden meanings. When she died in 1983, she was buried according to traditional customs, but the funeral was attended by university professors and government ministers alongside her Bedouin relatives. They recognized, perhaps too late, that something irreplaceable was being lost. Her granddaughter found, among her few possessions, a notebook filled with careful Arabic script, hundreds of techniques and observations that Fatima had recorded in her final months. The last entry, written in a hand that shook with age but remained determined, was a simple statement. This knowledge is not old, it is waiting. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps in our climate-controlled, GPS-guided world, we're slowly learning that some wisdom can't be Googled, some skills can't be downloaded, some understanding only comes from generations of careful observation and hard-won experience. As her voice finally joined the wind that had always been her companion, something essential floated out into the night. Knowledge that had survived for centuries, now seeking new minds willing to receive it, new hands willing to preserve it for an uncertain future. And now, as these ancient voices fade into the whisper of wind across sand, you drift back slowly to your own world, to your bed, your pillow, your safe walls that protect you from any desert's harsh embrace. Feel yourself returning, carrying something of their resilience with you into this gentle space. The sheets beneath you, the roof above you, the glass of water within arm's reach. All of these are luxuries that would have seemed impossible to those desert travelers, gifts beyond their wildest dreams. Yet perhaps tonight, as you settle into comfort they never knew, you'll remember what they understood so clearly, that humans are capable of extraordinary adaptation, that strength often grows in the hardest places, that community becomes most precious when survival depends on it. Maybe you'll think differently about the challenges in your own life, problems that feel overwhelming but aren't matters of life and death, stresses that seem unbearable but don't require the constant vigilance of scanning horizons for sandstorms. Their patient endurance can teach your impatient heart that most difficulties, like desert seasons, eventually pass. In your dreams tonight, you might hear the soft bells of caravans crossing impossible distances, the quiet conversations of people who learn to find joy in the smallest oases, the gentle songs that encoded centuries of wisdom about how to survive what seems unsurvivable. And when you wake tomorrow morning to abundance they could never have imagined, running water, electric lights, food that appears in stores without months of dangerous travel, perhaps you'll carry a small piece of their gratitude with you, their deep appreciation for every small gift that made life possible in an impossible place. The desert still exists, of course. The sun still blazes with the same intensity. The sand still shifts with ancient patience. The stars still shine with the clarity that guided those long-ago travelers home. But now you know something about the people who made that harsh place their home, who found poetry in survival, who discovered that the hardest places often teach the gentlest